This video will cover both the recruitment for and selection of participants for focus group interviews. All materials covered and referenced are compiled from Kruger and Casey's text, Focus Groups, a practical guide for applied research. Within this video, we'll be covering sampling procedures, the composition and size of focus groups, how to find participants using a variety of different methods, also covering selecting participants and different recruiting strategies. So let's get started by discussing sampling procedures. When researchers approach focus group interviewing, they oftentimes carry with them many of the traditions and procedures that they were intended for experimental or quantitative studies. Some of these procedures don't transfer. Let's begin by talking about randomization. Random sampling is one procedure that's effective in experimental research, but oftentimes of very limited value in focus group research. Remember that random selection is particularly appropriate when the inferences are made to a larger population. Therefore, a random sample of sufficient size becomes an adequate substitution for surveying the entire population. But that is not what the purpose of focus groups are. Let's keep in mind the intent of focus groups. The intent of focus groups is actually not to infer, but rather to understand. The intent is not to generalize, but rather to determine the range. The intent is also not to make statements about a population, but rather to provide insights about how people in the groups perceive a situation. Now remember, while a degree of randomization may be used, it's really never the primary factor in selection. When randomization is used in focus groups, it's often to eliminate the selection bias that's inherent in some forms of personal recruitment. With all sampling strategies, you must always ask yourself and be very concerned about the degree to which the strategy that you've chosen could lead to distortions in the data. You need to anticipate the questions about the means of selection that you've decided and be able to prepare to defend your rationale about your decisions. Let's move on to talk about the composition and size of focus groups. The focus group is characterized by homogeneity, but with sufficient variation among participants to allow for contrasting opinions. By homogeneity, we mean they have something in common that you're interested in. For example, it could be an occupation, it could be they were part of a program or a service, it could be an age, their gender, family characteristics, but the guiding principle is the degree to which these factors will influence sharing within this group discussion. You're going to be asking yourself which people have the greatest insight on your topic, but how you put them together is very important. Be careful about mixing individuals from different life stages and styles unless a topic clearly cuts across these life stages and styles. Consider whether or not it's good to be mixing genders. There are times when it's unwise to mix genders, particularly if the topic of discussion is experienced differently by gender. Now let's discuss size of focus groups. Traditionally, focus groups, when people were doing marketing research, they used groups of 10 to 12 people. This is much too large for educational research. The ideal size of a focus group for most of our research topics will be 5 to 8 participants. Don't plan focus groups with more than 10, because these large groups are difficult to control, and they also limit each person's opportunity to share insights and observations. For example, if you're in a focus group and someone doesn't have the opportunity to talk, they might decide to lean to the next person and start whispering. This is a sign that the group is much too large and people aren't given the same opportunity to express their opinions. The purpose of your study and the participant characteristic yields clues to the ideal size of the group that you want to choose. If the study is to gain understanding of people's experiences, the researcher typically would need more in-depth insights. This is usually best accomplished with smaller groups. Smaller groups are preferable when the participants have a great deal to share about the topic. Larger groups, such as maybe 8, work well when the study is designed to pilot test materials or ideas, and the participants don't have a lot of knowledge about the topic. So again, it's very important to consider these pieces. The purpose of the study. If the purpose is to understand an issue or behavior, invite fewer people. If the purpose is to pilot test, invite more. Consider the complexity of the topic. The more complex a topic, invite fewer people. Consider participants' level of experience or expertise. The more experience they have, you should invite fewer people. Consider participants' level of passion about the topic. Again, the more passionate, you would invite fewer people. And lastly, the number of questions that you want to cover. The more questions you want to cover, you guessed it, you should invite fewer people. Let's move on now to talk about strategies for finding participants. The first strategy I'm going to talk about are lists. The best way to begin to think about collecting your strategies for finding participants would be to consider whether or not there's an existing list that already is available. The next method you could consider when trying to recruit participants is a snowball sample. In a snowball sample, you ask those who have already passed through the selection criteria for nominations. The logic is that people know people like themselves. The study must have some type of obvious benefit to the community or an individual, or another type of incentive should be used. And we're going to talk about piggyback focus groups. A piggyback focus group is a focus group that's added to another event, meeting, or occasion. The participants are already gathered for another purpose, and the focus group is held during the free time, during a meal, or after hours, so as not to interrupt the primary purpose of the gathering. This strategy works very well with professional associations or special interest associations. We'll cover 3 more different strategies. First is focus groups on location. If you do a focus group on location, you would be at a place where the participants come for recreation or shopping or some other purpose. Recruiters often stop participants as they pass through a gate and ask certain screening criteria questions. Then they offer an invitation to be part of a focus group. The focus group is then held after this in a convenient location. Now, one thing about this method is that you need to exercise care so that those selected have the actual characteristics that you're looking for. For example, you can think about a nature center, a zoo, or a recreational center. They might choose random people coming through the gate and invite them to a special discussion. Then the incentive to participate might be free tickets to another visit at that location. Another method is organizational recruiting. Now, this is a most effective recruiting strategy that's oftentimes overlooked. This is where people are most likely to agree to participate and show up if someone they know invites them. So someone from the organization serves as your recruiting person. The sponsoring organization does the recruiting for you, but there are certain caveats. There are several factors to consider before using this option, and the very most important one is the issue of trust between the individual that you're asking to recruit for you and the organization. Having the right person make that contact and having the right person describe the benefits and the studies and the risks is really important. The success of insider recruiting really depends on the perceived trust between the employee or that volunteer that you're looking for and the organization. So it may not be super effective if trust has recently been damaged or has historically been awkward. And lastly, we'll talk about ads or announcements in newspapers or on bulletin boards. So within the past few years, there has been quite a bit of increase in people deciding to recruit for focus groups using some type of advertisement in electronic media, for example, or simply on bulletin boards and places where people will see them. These ads invite participants into a research study or a focus group to participate in some type of research process. Now that we've talked about strategies, let's talk about selecting participants. Kruger and Casey offer the following general steps to guide the selection process. And that first step is called setting exact specifications. These are oftentimes called screens. As precisely as possible, identify the demographic and observable characteristics of the people that you want in your group. These characteristics can be called screens. So for example, let's say you want your participants to first of all be women. That would be your first screen. They must be from a particular county in, let's say, North Dakota. That would be your second screen. And these women from the particular county would need to have a baby under the age of 1. that would be your third screen, and who would also be a first-time mom, your fourth screen. So there are multiple characteristics that are required for that person to be in your research study. Be cautious when making selections of unobservable factors such as attitudes or opinions or values. And remember, the more specifications you have, or the more screens that you have, the more difficult it's going to be to locate people. The more screens, the more difficult it will be to get participants. Step 2, you need to carefully design your recruiting process. There's always a process that must be outlined ahead of time. When you outline your recruiting strategy ahead of time, you'll save yourself a lot of time in the actual recruitment process. So these are the things that you'll need to consider. Ask yourself, how will you select participants? How will you decide on a strategy for filling the groups? How will you contact the potential participants? How will you go about sending out confirmation letters or memos? What's the best way for you to make a reminder phone call or reminder follow-ups? And how will you share the list with your moderator? Spending some time deciding these questions will help you in your design for your recruiting process. Step 3, you need to generate a pool of names of potential participants. Now, a pool is a list of the names of the people who fit your specific specifications or screens. You might have generated your pool through that list, nominations, ads, or announcements that we previously discussed. But the pool is all the potential people who fit your specifications. The fourth step is now to randomize names to reduce bias. Now, previously we talked about randomization as not being appropriate. Here is where randomization does help to reduce the potential bias within your pool. So randomization helps to ensure a non-biased cross-section, essentially giving anyone in the pool an equal chance of selection. So here, randomization is an effective strategy to minimize selection bias. Randomization is not recommended for the entire population, but rather just for those who are passing your selection screens in your selection process. And lastly, know that no process is perfect. We make the best choices that we can with the knowledge that we have and the resources that we have available at that time to make the decision. Spending time thinking about and asking yourself questions ahead of time will help in that process, but at the very end, no process is perfect. Let's move into talking about recruiting strategies. The most important thing to remember in recruiting strategies is you have to think through and practice the invitation. So before you start to recruit, it's really important to clearly think about these particular areas. You should be able to know and be able to talk very quickly and easily about the study, who is sponsoring the study, why the study is important, what will be done with the results and who will benefit, how you got that person's name, why you're inviting them, and how they might benefit from participating. These are all important things that you should be able to talk about very quickly and easily right off the top of your head without having to struggle with names or pieces of paper or contacts. You should be able to discuss all of those. That helps when you're contacting participants so they feel comfortable with you and they know you understand your study as well. It's also important to think about setting the meeting time, date, and location. So obviously thinking ahead about the dates, the times, and places that are most convenient for your participants. Not necessarily convenient for you, but convenient for your participants. Don't select meeting dates that don't conflict with something that might be particularly happening with your population, and understand that people's schedules need to be flexible. You'll need to choose times that are flexible, again, not for yourself, but flexible for your participants. Make sure that you make personal contacts with your potential participants. Personal contacts are oftentimes the best. I also recommend sending a personalized confirmation letter and making a reminder phone call as you're contacting your participants. Now let's talk a little bit about incentivizing. There are certain incentives that can be used, and one of them is clearly money as an incentive. By far, this is the most common type of incentive that people are given, money or a gift card to some store like Target or a movie theater. Typically, each person within a particular group would get an equivalent payment. So you should make sure that everyone who participates gets the equivalent type of payment or gift card. There are also non-monetary incentives. This incentive is something that's symbolic, and other symbols may be worthy substitutes. So for example, food. Oftentimes, food, either a light snack or a full meal, can be used as an incentive to get people to participate. So, over the course of this video, you've been able to understand what sampling procedures are, what are ideal composition and size, strategies that you can use to find your participants, things that you have to think about when selecting your participants, and also different types of recruiting strategies and incentives. Again, all the materials covered and referenced are compiled from Kruger and Casey's text, Focus Groups, A Practical Guide for Applied Research. I hope you enjoyed the recruitment and selection of participants videos for focus groups.